Welcome to the Digital Void Virtual Salon series, and thank you for joining us here tonight. Tonight, we will examine what exactly it means to be human in a technocracy with two of the most capable people of discussing this subject. First, it is my privilege to welcome the host of the Digital Void Virtual Salon series, digital media culture expert, writer, and international talker, Dr. Jamie Cohen, as well as the Humanist Chaplain of Harvard and MIT, as well as the New York Times bestselling author of Good Without God, Greg Epstein. Greg, Jamie, thanks so much for joining tonight.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you for that introduction. That was wonderful. And thank you,
Thanks,
Greg,
Josh,
so much for being here. I've really been very excited to talk to you, just because I think I've spent a lot of my most recent research in the humanist space, especially where the intersection between tech culture and digital media and digital cultures exist. And so I started looking at a lot of what you do and what you do on campus and what you do in your own work. And I really wanted to talk to you about it because I wanted to bring to the audience a lot of the thoughts of how you apply your thoughts about humanism and tech and culture and how it applies to students, which you're mostly in direct contact with. So first, I'd love for you to give a little bit of a background of what you do at Harvard, MIT, and what your role is there.
Sure. Yeah, it's an unusual role. It never ceases to amaze me. I've been Humanist Chaplain at Harvard since 2005. Joined MIT as well in 2018, but really since 2005, I've been answering people's questions about what is a humanist chaplain. And I mean, it's just evergreen. I mean, like you can introduce one group of people to it, but then the rest of the people anywhere and everywhere are still like, huh, what's that?
Right.
So I am a chaplain to and for the non-religious. I myself am a humanist. You could call me an atheist if you want, if you prefer that term, or a free thinker or a secular person or whatever it is. But I am, more importantly, a chaplain that serves students at Harvard and MIT, as well as faculty and staff and others around the university communities who define themselves as atheist or agnostic or non-religious, or who have some interest in that affiliation and that identity. And the idea for me is we all have things we don't believe in. And that is important. It's important to define ourselves by what we don't believe in at times and in places. But more importantly, once we've figured out what we don't believe, which is something that I, maybe started working on a little earlier in my life. Like, even when I was a teenager, I was coming up with plenty of ideas for things that I didn't believe in. What do we believe? What is it that we positively stand for, if not that, if not, in my case, traditional religion? Who are we about? Who are we and what are we about, rather?
Right.
And being a humanist chaplain is about, to me, helping people to answer that question for themselves and to figure out if we have some kind of collective answer that is worth reflecting on about this. Who are we together as a society, as a community, if we're not defined by religious belief and religious faith?
Right. That's, to me, is important for you to even just talk about that, because I never really, I think college was my kind of awakening toward the idea of how to define an identity of not belief, trying to figure out what it means. I think identities are collective of everything that's around you. And when you start realizing things that aren't working for that identity, you start trying to ask questions about yourself. Is there a gap or a void that I'm missing? Is there something not right about that? And who can I go to? And before learning that there are positions like this, it was like, it was kind of like experimentation. And it's interesting for you to say like 2005, because it's like, that would have been around the time of like the birth of YouTube and a lot of these sites and a lot of people getting a lot of data information all at once. And like this extra flow of connection. And then there was like, now we have literal problems of people still turning to that. And so it's like, it's nice to hear that there's people whose intent is to like kind of guide people to that space. And I'm assuming that's where the term chaplain comes in specific?
Yeah, chaplain's a term that I didn't choose for myself. You don't get ordained as a chaplain. A chaplain is a term that's usually conferred upon a professional by an institution. In this case, the two universities both gave me that title. Chaplains started out a long time ago as a religious thing in European armies. The chaplain was the person where the soldiers would be conscripted. They'd be taken away from their hometown where they might have their home church that they were expected to go to. And once they couldn't go to that anymore, the chaplain was the person who was responsible for providing them with an opportunity to do whatever religious or spiritual reflection work service they needed to do.
Sure.
And initially it was just a Christian thing, then it became Christian Jewish, then Christian Jewish Muslim.
Mm-hmm.
And then my predecessor at Harvard, the first humanist chaplain at Harvard, started there in the 1970s and was not only probably the first humanist chaplain in North American history, but one of the very first chaplains in North American history to not be either Christian, Jewish, or Muslim. And now there are chaplains at a range of institutions from a range of different religious and non-religious backgrounds. So there's that. And then, just the idea of again, helping people with a sense of meaning, purpose. And I think, that's how I found my way to you, or rather vice versa, because in the last couple of years, especially since I joined MIT as well, MIT is a tech school. Mm-hmm. And I was asked to expand my work to MIT. And as soon as I just got started reflecting on tech and meaning. And it quickly dawned on me that what we call tech now is so overwhelmingly large and broad a category, mm-hmm. and important a category, powerful a category, right? What isn't tech today? Name any industry that isn't essentially a tech industry at this point. It's very hard to do that. I mean, wicker chairs. I mean, what are you going to do? What are you going to come up with? And so, for me, with my background and my training and my day-to-day experience, it just sort of started to click to me that tech has become, sociologically speaking, like a religion.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
It's like this giant religion that has its priests and its prophets, its mm-hmm. rituals, its hierarchies, its sacred texts and meanings and stories that it tells itself. And like many religions before it probably is pretty badly in need of some reform. And in the last couple of years, my little brain has been absorbed in thinking about that idea.
So let's talk about humanism a bit. How do you? Sure. I teach an environmental humanities course, and I consider myself a humanist. But I do believe that there's a bit of a spectrum, not too big on humanism. What's yours? Because I'm pretty sure yours and I's we're aligned. My environmental humanities course was called New Media and Social Transformation, and its goal was basically along those lines. I co-taught it with a theologian, an ex-Catholic, and she had brought her points of view directly to the course to talk more about spirituality, as in trying to find ourselves within what she called like the Instagram problem, which was this place where people were starting to present their identities or present themselves through a presentation of self. Mm. And how do we bring that back to the human? How do we bring that back to the person?
Yeah.
So how do you describe humanism from the work?
Which is not a problem. What she described as the Instagram problem is not a problem that human beings evolved to contend with, but it has become one of the most profound challenges to being human today, to being human in whatever way we might think of as the best way or the best ways to be. It's totally novel, and it challenges us to our core. And so, but I would say about humanism, first of all, just technically, it's one of these words that has a few different definitions depending on who you ask and what aspect of the history of it you're looking at. I mean, it's not the first or only word to have multiple competing definitions, right?
Sure.
but
Yeah,
in
almost all of them.
what the definitions have in common, they're sort of interwoven. So there was this thing in the Renaissance in Europe that where people started using the word humanism to refer to a kind of Renaissance thought where there was, for the first time in sort of, since Christian Europe began, there was this notion that there were things worth knowing that were not simply part of the mind of the Christian God. Right. Like, since Christianity took over this enormous empire with the rise of Constantine in the 4th century,
yeah,
the official line had been the only things worth knowing in human life are part of knowing the mind of God. And the humanists were the ones that said, no, there's something just about being human that's worth knowing.
Right.
A few hundred years later, people came along. The first people that came along to redefine the word were actually liberal clergy emerging from the Christian tradition. They were no longer Christian. They were studying evolution as it had been elucidated by Darwin and others. They were studying textual criticism. The Bible as a piece of literature that was written over centuries by many different authors. They were studying technology and science and anthropology and sociology. And so they realized, like, we're not that anymore. We're not Christian anymore. We're not really even religious anymore. What are we? Who are we? And they adopted that word that the Renaissance folks had used to mean something a little different, which is kind of how I use it now, which is to say, good without God, good without a God, whatever you want to call it. The idea that we are, if we're not religious, we are this other positive identity. We are this this way of nurturing values, of being good human beings in a non-religious or secular context. And that's that's like what I am now. That's what I teach now. If you call what I do teaching, that's what I'm passionate about.
Then that is exactly, that explanation is what we present to the students. And I taught at a Catholic college, and it was Dominican. It worked, but it wasn't really part of the curriculum. It was just a knowledge that you went to a Dominican college. But in the class, we basically were trying to give comfort, and I'm assuming this is kind of what you work on too, is trying to give comfort to people who've kind of lost, I don't want to say they lost faith, but they lost that belief that was structured into their lives, that was given to them by their parents. We use that as a wider metaphor as well, trying to explain to them that a lot of their previous biases or ways that they interpret reality come from things that were like environmental in a sense, not environmental like the environment, but more of like their parents, their peers.
Yeah. And
as they come to school, it's kind of like their chance to like redefine themselves or really get a sense of it. And we were trying to explain, like, those aren't your only options, there's ways of dealing with it. And our goal though wasn't just to like give them an okayness or an out, but it was really a sense of like saying, what do you rely on? Where are you every day? How much of a belief or a desire do you have to do certain things? And in peeling those layers back over time, we found that like young people really like, and this isn't a critical in any way, but they've come to be reliant on their tech, and tech being like the device in this case. But the reliance on the tech as almost like a need or a companion at all times, almost like the way somebody would wear a cross. It's like they're.
Well, by the way, it's not necessarily even that they're when we say they're relying on tech, that they're relying on the device, right? Because even the device, if it was just a piece of metal and plastic, it would be an empty shell, right? Sure. It's every aspect of what we're putting into it, right? It's all the different kinds of software and what each of them represent. It's the algorithms that we're programming into them to addict us, absolutely to addict us. It's really it's the connection of the self to these broader societal trends that, you know, on the one hand, it feels like the whole world is open to us. And on the other hand, it's like the whole world is conspiring to treat us as a product, a disposable product that is a source of, we are a source of revenue, a tiny source of revenue for these companies.
How much do you think that students know, or young people know, that revenue model is part of the usage? Like, how do you think that's an awareness, or do you think that's something that has to be kind of like revealed?
Yeah, it's really interesting, and it goes to some of the work that I've been doing for TechCrunch in the past year. I spent a year as their ethicist in residence, is the title they eventually gave me. Great and it was a lot of fun, and I wrote a number of pieces for them. You can just sort of look up my name, Greg Epstein, at the TechCrunch site. But maybe a favorite piece that I wrote for them was it's called "Will the Future of Work Be Ethical?" And what it was is I had a chance to attend a conference put on by the MIT Technology Review, which is the MIT's flagship publication. And they do a big conference every summer called MTech Next, where it's all about the emerging technologies that are going to dominate our world, our planet, our solar system, our whole universe in the next generation. And I wanted to go and see what this thing was like. And I ended up going and writing sort of like a whole, to me, it was like a sociological review of this entire environment where people are trying to do what I call tech prophecy, right? Predicting the future. That's in religion, that's prophecy. But I tried to make it fun and readable. I almost like a page turner is what I wanted it to be. But the unexpected, really fun part of that conference was I got to interview all these experts, journalists and scholars and activists and robotics engineers and entrepreneurs and all sorts of things at this conference. But one of the most fascinating people I met was a young woman who was there with her parents. She was a high school junior at the time from Phillips Exeter Academy, which is one of the most prestigious boarding school high schools in the world. And it was not her first time attending this conference. And I finally ended up talking to her because every panel, every major conference session would have these Q&A lines. And there she would be at the end of the line, like ready to ask her question, like standing ready at attention, and she always had a great question. I mean, she just was sort of very obviously 16, 17 years old, but always had a great question for all these world-renowned experts.
That's awesome.
And finally, started interviewing her. Her mother was sitting right there. She was beaming with pride at her daughter. And I really enjoyed sort of doing this interview with the mother, just sitting right there. And I started asking her, like, tell me about how you feel about these technologies and social justice, and she had really wonderfully informed opinions about the technologies and the inequality that they create, the technologies and the way that AI can manipulate us and sort of treat us as a product. The ways in which, as you just said, we are the product, right? But then I really found myself wanting to know, well, how does that square? She was genuinely concerned with inequality and justice in society. And you ever think, though, you're 16 and you have already had a much better education in technology, not only than I've ever had, but than 99.999% of the world's population would ever hope to get.
Sure.
You are the problem of inequality. And how do you square that with your desire to create justice? What you've done is you put yourself in a position, you've been put in a position to win every single one of these fights. And now you're going to be the one that's going to make it a just world. How does that work?
Wow.
And she was, to her credit, the young woman's name is Maylee Gupta, and to her credit, she was really game for that discussion. I don't know that she had the right answers. I don't know that I had the right answers for that matter. But then she later gave me the opportunity to come and visit her entire class.
Oh, that's so cool.
At Exeter. And what it was is there were these 2 classes, seminar classes of students at Exeter taking what they called Silicon Valley ethics.
Really?
And so you've got all these Exeter students who are being paired with Exeter alumni. People, Exeter alumni include people like Andrew Yang and I mean, I could go on and on and on. To work with them on their startup project or their technology leadership project, whatever it is, and to get to ask questions and to get their advice on the student would have their own project, right? Sure. So here you have all these students being asked to weigh in on the future of technology. They're being mentored by, senior VPs at Google and this and that. And before the coronavirus came, I was getting ready to go and do the same kind of discussion with students at Fenway High School, which is an urban, mostly Black and Latinx public high school in the middle of downtown Boston near Fenway Park. Haven't had a chance to do that discussion yet because of the virus, but wanting to compare those two very badly.
You're speaking directly to my heart here. Teaching on South Shore of Long Island, we have districts in need, and one of the projects that I did a while back was something called a collaboratory, which was this space that was supposed to bring diverse points of view, diverse communities into one area. And we actually started a project that we didn't get to finish, unfortunately. We lost funding on it, but it was like something along the lines of the SAVs and the SAV-nots. And it was access versus non-access and how savvy someone may be based on their access. And we found in just basic testing and empirical evidence that the differences were minimal. It was just more about where the projection would be in the future, like what their launch padding would be. Yeah. And we found that the ability to be savvy or knowledgeable of the platforms in which they're using happens a lot to do with how they just interpret. One is inequality. Like you're bringing up like a big point about privilege of not realizing. I always tell my students in school, and especially like in other schools, like just the fact you're in school, you understand that you have something that others don't. It is something that we take for granted because we're like, oh, we're here, so we're all part of this. But you don't really understand that this is globally, it's getting to the point where it's almost half of the earth is like on the internet, but it's still the minority. And so humanism in that sense is like, we often show films like Manufactured Landscapes or Anthropocene or films that show the diversity of human life that are all over the planet and what it looks like to not be connected. And that to the students is like, we don't try to make that as like something that's what is that, like zoologically like bullshit. Like we don't make it so they're just looking at it. Like we're trying to make it seem like this is something you have to empathize with. And so we do, back to your tech point earlier, is like, when you talk about tech, I always like to use Timothy Maughan's thing from Infinite Detail, because he's a fiction writer, but his version of tech is that it is everything, like you say. Like he makes a huge example, because the book is dystopian, it takes place after the end of the internet, and all these parts of China that are abandoned because the container ships no longer operate because they were inventoried via the internet. And so when we think about tech, that I always show, like, if you hold, we talk about, I'm a media archaeologist. So we always talk about like how many human beings were involved in making, well, mine's broken too, but like how many human beings are involved in this? If I were to snap it, how many humans have been interacting with this content, this machine, before we get to beyond the machine? And it's hundreds of human beings have touched the phone before you even get there. And that alone, when they realized that, how did the gold get in your phone? Do you think that was mined? Do you think that a human got that? And it's like when they start realizing that every element of what they hold can be kind of extrapolated out and then looked at by pieces, there's no such thing as pieces, it's people, So it's like that was a good breach. And I think that I wish I had the access points to talk to young people like in their high schools and stuff. But like do you think there's do you think it's important for young, not like high school, like K-12 early parts, do you think they should be getting exposed to a lot of this information, or is this like too heavy? Are we like...
No. I try to have this conversation on a daily basis with my 3.5-year-old son. I really do. And The only part of that bothers me is that I know that I'm only in some ways advancing the problem because he's going to be better informed than other kids will be, but not better informed than they should be.
Oh,
and no, because I think, he's consuming technology blindly. Like, I mean, to him, it's being fed to him like, like oxygen is fed to all of us, right?
Sure.
He doesn't even know it exists until he's deprived of it. And the idea that it's not the way that we think it is, right? Like he'll watch episodes during this pandemic of like a show that's created by Amazon called it's a show about jets that deliver things to little children. And, the idea that I try to have him remember is, the fact that we're, that we're having these products delivered to us, let's remember that that the fact that we're getting these things delivered to us, that this is what we're being given. It just, that's the problem, right? Like that we're, by having robots that can bring children each device or each product that they want, that destroys the environment, right?
Right.
And so like the jet will be helping the small child to, divert a river that melted from a glacier. It's like the fact that that small child in Africa or Latin America has 3 robots to help him or her solve a problem is exactly what caused that glacier to melt.
That's right. Yep.
And what I want to quickly add about humanism and why I think this is so relevant to humanism is, to me, what humanism comes down to. It's not about whether there is a God or there isn't a God, or there is a religion that we should believe in or isn't. It's more basic than that. It's the idea that we have an innate desire to live a good life. We want good things to happen to us and to the ones we love, not bad things. We want to feel that we are flourishing, doing well, having our needs met, feeling content more often than not, satisfied more often than not, and have a decent future to look forward to. We all want that.
Right.
And if none of that is guaranteed to us by a deity, if none of that is guaranteed to us by a prophecy, if none of that can be secured by prayer or by performing a certain ritual, then what it all comes down to is we are fully responsible.
That's it.
Individually and collectively, in a web of mutual responsibility, a single garment of destiny, to echo Martin Luther King Jr., to bring about that world that we would all want, and that ultimately, I can't have that world that I want in a secure way unless you also have that world, and unless every human being also has that world. And that was a little difficult to grasp, I think, for a lot of people, maybe until this pandemic, because there were so many ways for people like me, and perhaps like you yourself or members of this audience, but certainly like me, to kind of shield ourselves from that and feel that, you know what, I can have a pretty good life and other people can have a shit one.
Right.
But now we're learning that we are really only as safe and secure and healthy as the least of the people who surround us, to echo the New Testament.
Yeah.
And that either will reshape our world, or woe be us. Woe be upon us.
I agree with that. I think, to be very specific about the pandemic, is that I think it lays bare a lot of everything. I mean, First, let me make sure that everybody knows that if they have questions, they could ask as well. I think that would be very cool to continue that conversation. But to be on the point of the pandemic, it lays bare a lot of the things that we are seeing in direct action at this moment, and we're seeing with protests, and we're seeing with like the world. We've come to, I don't want to say we've taken it for granted, but there was a moments or length of time in which we kind of became normalized to poor behavior that was just operating around us, but we just normalize it as this is just how things are. And when structures start collapsing, even minimally or maximally, depending on which part of the country or world you're actually in, it immediately becomes very vacant, where it was like, okay, it's almost that realization that all we have is us. Like, this is who we are. This is us. Like, and that odd, I don't want to call it like a misbelief in like the things, is I think not, well, first, I don't want to ever place the position of like, it's good to have seen or understand that these things aren't real. But I think if there is a slight possibility of a benefit to this, it will be that the collectiveness will realize that we have collective power that's away from what we've come to believe. And to bring it back to tech, the hollowness of tech like became very, very apparent very, very rapidly. Like, it was almost as if like we had slowly, like, I want you to like use that example of like that, the deities or the prophets of the people of tech who kind of built their life around being these authoritative figures that kind of world built. They kind of design where we are. Zuckerberg built worlds. I mean, those are worlds inside of the platform.
And they're treated, you know, they're treated like demigods.
Yeah. Yep.
You know, Steve Jobs and Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg and you know, Sergey and Larry and you know, but by the way, anybody notice anything in common with the men that I just mentioned, right? And they're treated like absolute demigods, like Achilles dipped in gold.
Yeah. And then from that, I just had like one of the most recent things, and I was actually reading your interview with Andrew Morantz today, because that's my personal study, is like on rabbit holes and extremism and like seeing where these things go. It's their ability to turn profit over people was like it was like kind of like, oh, these are just how the systems go. It's free. And like whenever you're using free anything, it's like, oh, well, I'd rather not pay. So if this is the cost of that, then that's what happens. But then when we see like there's no actual tangible benefit to any of these things, that like when the time does happen, that your community boards actually start hurting you rather than benefiting you, you realize, oh, the profit model is misdesigned. And I think that's one of the most recent events that I think is people are talking about, is like advertisers finally being like, all right, maybe now we know that we're the top level, we're above tech. And so they're like, maybe we have to have some sort of control. And I don't think that's a ethical, like, it's nobody like sat there and was like, had an ethics decision. It was more along the lines of, how can we long-term sustain this? And this
right. That's interesting. Yeah. That for what feels like a generation, but that's only because in the world of tech, you know, 5 to 10 years is a generation.
Yeah.
But you know, what feels like that, you know, epochal, you know, frame of time, we've gone from, you know, like advertisers really did, you know, the marketing used to control technology.
Yeah.
You know, and because the sort of, I think I'm thinking of the technologies like television and radio and things like that, right? And you know, they were completely driven by marketing. Right. But then, as you implied, right, the tech, capital T, like what we think of as tech now, did seem to supersede the marketing industry for a while, and be this sort of towering thing unto itself. But actually, you know, when you one thing is that, yeah, the marketing industry has sort of reasserted itself, but also we've kind of figured out that a company like Facebook or a company like Google, they're not really tech companies actually that much after all. They're really more like just big marketing companies.
That's it. Mm-hmm.
They market and they advertise, and they're just sort of, they use certain kinds of digital technologies to expand upon.
That's right.
The culture of, really, it's a white supremacist culture.
Yeah.
That once again privileges people like me. even though I have many aspects of my background that don't fit an easy narrative of like me as the privileged person,
Sure.
Still I've had a lot of advantages in life just because I kind of sort of look the part.
Mm-hmm.
And I think others watching this may have had that experience too. Either they share that, or somebody else, or they were locked out of that because of that reason.
Mm-hmm.
And so it can be a white supremacist culture, not a conscious one. I mean, we're not talking about Nazi tattoos on the arms of these people. Structural, right? All the stuff we're having a reckoning around right now.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea is marketing, I think, becomes the kind of, it's the ritual and it's the text of the religion. In other words, it's the idea that we will tell ourselves a story about who we are. We're tall, we're American, we're sexy, we own cool cars, we're big fans of hip hop or baseball or whatever, like we consume these products. We are a certain thing.
Yeah.
And the idea is, it fuels narcissism, meaning that it makes us be very proud of ourselves on the one hand, on the surface, because we're feeling the pain of insecurity and lack of self-esteem underneath the surface.
Mm-hmm.
But then the more insecurity we feel, the more pride we feel like we need to demonstrate on top.
That's right.
And it seems like it serves us, but it doesn't actually serve our humanity. It serves sort of the individuals who are doing the marketing, but really it serves the cycle of marketing itself. It's a self-perpetuating thing. Daniel Dennett talked about religion. Religion exists to perpetuate religion.
That's right.
And our marketing economy exists to perpetuate itself. It's almost like it's not even anybody's fault anymore. Peter Gomes, the head of religion at Harvard, many years ago, used to say, if we knew who was in charge at Harvard, we don't know who's in charge at Harvard, because if we really knew who was really in charge, we would have to destroy them.
Yeah.
And that's what our whole, there's no one person that you can point to. We want to point to Donald Trump. I certainly wish I could point to him and do whatever I wanted to do.
Part of this is I talk about this consistently. I mean, this is a large scale civic engagement question or civic knowledge question, which is that we'd want to, sorry, this is going to be, we're having a thunderstorm, so there's sirens.
We have life these days.
Yeah, it is. And if you live in the cities, it's even louder. We want to point at a figurehead, but we have to remember they are figureheads because the system itself, or the structural thing, is designed to obfuscate. And you bring up such an important moment about what these platforms are. When you talk about Facebook or Google, I think like most recently we found out like it's like over 90% of all their income is just ads. So it's like, it's just like amazing to think that like it's become so clear that these don't have any value system except for capitalism. And so when we look at who's in charge of Harvard or who's in charge of Facebook, it's they're the CEOs or the presidents or whatever they are, but it's the system operates it. And I don't think you should downplay the white supremacist thing. It's not white supremacy as in like a violence of that, but it is violence in the sense that that's how it was built. It was top down, privileging a monocultural experience. And we've actually, like we've had on many scholars on here that offer critique of that. And I think it's really important for us. I think that's the most important skill that young people can have, is not the ability to be mad at it or get off the platforms, but just to be critical of their access points at all times. Is like that, just understand that it's like, that's going to be something we have to constantly like be aware of. And I think that's when we do digital media blackouts for our students, it's like a 24-hour detox. So like just bury it. The biggest concern, I think,
pain. I mean, you go through pain to try to do that.
The pain comes from this weird habitual act of streaks, where they have to keep streaks for like Snapchat or whatever it is. And I'm like, that's so strange. Because so then we, just to do a slight tangent on that, is we use the movie Her quite often as a tool. And there's a line in the film that they love. And I try to remind them that line is so important to advertising. There's a point in the film where Samantha, the robot, says to Theo, The past is just a story we tell ourselves. And they're just like, oh, that's so beautiful. And I'm like, do you understand that's the robot, because that's the only data she has? She only has the story that we tell ourselves. So it's a presentation of ourselves that gets quantified into the being of what we present ourselves as in the advertising model, that gets put into this feedback loop. And that's what Morantz talks about. That's what we all talk about, which is that eventually, if the platform works well for you, you're eventually just consuming your identity over and over. It's just this constant silo that you can't see out of.
Yeah. And I guess to me, the point of all of that, and, you know, with the white supremacy part, you can read a piece that I just recently did for TechCrunch, where I interviewed the still current New York Times #1 best-selling author in paperback nonfiction, Ijeoma Oluo, who wrote this book, So You Want to Talk About Race, which is, you know, has been #1 on the New York Times list for weeks and weeks and weeks. Everybody's buying it and reading it. But then she has a really wonderfully interesting tech background that you can read about it in my piece. And we sat down for an hour and a half at near her home in Seattle in January and talked about, so you want to talk about tech, so you want to talk about race in tech. Mm-hmm. But, you know, as a sort of final thought here, I guess, you know, just this idea that we're the only ones who have any ability to shape what human future is going to look like. And it's not perfect, but the idea that we could have some positive contribution to a human world in which there's more to rely on and more to be part of than the culture that we have now, that where we could take, maybe there's some of the more positive elements of the culture that we have now and improve upon all of this. Mm-hmm.
Do you think, on that note, like, before I want to ask you one more question, and we'll go bring up some questions on screen. Do you think, like, just from the amount of like collective data that's been acquired by these platforms and the knowledge of how much, like, I always remember that data is to give and capta is to take, you know, it's like we are giving the data. Do you think that tech, if we're not reliant on tech or like thinking of it separate from us, do you think there's ever a renegotiation of our agency with tech that's collective? Do you think we could together learn how to be collectively independent of tech while also working with it? We're never going to not be on the big T tech of like all these social media apps. We're never going to disconnect from all these things. But do you think we could regain our agency by what methods? Is it knowledge? Is it action?
I mean, you know, there, I want to say, I have a certain deference to others. You know, I'm certainly not the expert on, I'll give you a couple of opinions in a second, but I just want to say, I'm not the expert on, you know, how to reorganize our technologies. I've spent my life and my career to this point working on this thing we call humanism. And it's only through, you know, like my becoming obsessed in the last couple of years with the intersection between humanism and technology that I come to talk to you. But I just, you know, I don't want to like play a tech expert on TV in a way that I'm not. And I'll give it a shout out to Douglas Rushkoff, which is sort of how I connect to you.
Yep.
We're all connected. Your terrific producer, Josh, also works with Douglas Rushkoff. And I met him, Josh, that is, while I was working with Douglas to help him premiere his new book, Team Human, at Harvard. And I love that book. And I think that the idea that Team Human, that we all need to be on Team Human together, and that Team Human doesn't mean that we're all going to stop using technology, that, you know, that genie's out of the bottle, to mix metaphors even more than I've already been doing. But you know, the horse is out of the genie's bottle barn, whatever. Anyway, but the question is, can we keep in mind what our actual goals are? Mm-hmm. And I think that it helps if we're demythologizing ourselves and we're saying, look, we are these creatures. We're trillions of interconnected cells. We came from the Big Bang. We came from single-celled organisms here on this planet. And, you know, we had a very scary origin coming to consciousness in a universe that was very much bigger than us and really very difficult for us to understand or solve the problems in, right? Like how do I live? How do I overcome illness? How do I find something to do? How do I feed my family? We've been coping with that. And now we've created these things that are worth holding on to and expanding. The idea of democracy, we created it from nothing. The idea of jurisprudence and a system of laws by which we can govern ourselves and organize a society fruitfully, we created it from nothing. Journalism, the idea of documenting our history step by step and critiquing each development, questioning each statement. Science, the process of using a process of thinking to invent, to understand. We've created these things from nothing, and we can expand on them and improve them. And that is worth believing in. But we have to recognize that while we created those things from nothing, we created them in many ways as part of an oppressive, discriminatory, bigoted, power-hungry system. And so if we're going to hold on to them, we have to divest some of those problems from these inventions in order to keep them worth reinventing. And I'm intimidated by that process. I don't know how to do it. I don't know how to do it right.
Yeah. But
I know that I want to be a part of it. And I know that it's nice to feel like there's something worth being a part of.
Oh my God, that's a beautiful answer. That drives my work. That's gorgeous. That is incredible. That's exactly how we feel. Like to me, we need to recognize that we are human and we do this with the knowledge of the structures that got us to this moment. And I love your analogy. Josh and I were just talking about that. Like every once in a while we bring up the idea that, remember, if we start as a big bang, it's just violence and we are coherent at this moment, but that keeps it going. We're just flowing. We're here at this moment. We're alive. But we're mortal, and it's like we have to act with what we have in this body at this moment, and then let it keep going and do the work.
It's funny, the image that just came to me. I spend a lot of time these days with schools being closed with a preschooler trying to be his form of education, and trying to think about what forms of media he should consume and what he shouldn't. And a lot of it is a lot of the media is just flogging tech. It's just pimping tech openly and brazenly. These cartoon characters that are just inventing things left and right, and they're using it's like the kids don't even care about superpowers anymore. It's all about what tech does the robot dog have, And one of the thoughts that just came to me now is, I try to worry about the violence in the shows and the culture of violence that that like how much of that do I want to let him consume?
Right.
And it's sort of sad and frustrating at the same time that it's hard to figure out like what could be interesting and captivating to a child without being violent and explosive, right? Mm-hmm. And this is a little bit mystical, and I don't even mean it literally so, but just to be reminded that we literally, every aspect of who we are and what we are came from the most extraordinary explosion we could ever imagine.
Right.
And in a sense, that explosion, that Big Bang, was so enormous, so nuclear, so destructive and scary, even though there was no, as far as we can tell, conscious being to be scared by it. Just the thought that in some ways we're remembering our violent origin when we enact all these stories. I'm gonna have to process that, because again, I don't want to sort of try to act like I'm endorsing the book of Genesis, like in the beginning there was night, and there
I don't think that's biblical in any way. I think that's just our cells are embedded with stardust. I mean, that's just science.
Yeah.
We are part of a cosmic explosion that's still exploding. Like,
at the very least, if it's a story that we can tell ourselves to help ourselves understand why we're so compelled by those images, and then remember that we get to choose what images we want to put forward from there.
And you just answered the question. It's the agency part. So we have a question. Let's see. Leon asks, as you said, tech is now a religion in a sense. Do you think American political affiliation have also become akin to organized religion? Also, what should the role of social media be in vetting info? So 2 questions there.
Yeah. Get on it, Zuckerberg. Vet that stuff. You think advertising is going to come back in due time? Yeah, maybe if you make it worth doing. But yeah, I mean, I think that a difference between a political affiliation and a religious affiliation is perhaps that a political affiliation might be something that we choose in a more look, I'm betraying my bias here in that I'm somebody that believes that traditional religion is a myth that we created that involves stories that are not true.
Right.
Whereas a political affiliation, in my mind, could be an affiliation that we create based on a story that is true.
Oh. Mm-hmm.
So, in other words, we could create a political affiliation potentially that says we are a diverse and pluralistic group of people who are coming together to create a better future based on a scientific understanding of the universe, based on a shared interest in successful, educated democracy, based on collaboration and, with a recognition of centuries of privilege and oppression and dominance and a desire to do better than that. That's a story that we could tell ourselves, that could have rituals, that could have sacred moments, the way that we have religious holidays. It could have costumes, the red tie or the blue tie or whatever you want to wear now. I think the best politicians of our future are probably all going to wear like ripped punk rock t-shirts. And even that's gonna then be like, oh, those posers, they're wearing their ripped punk rock t-shirts. But that's the politician of the future anyway. But it has the costume, it has the whole thing. But it could be appropriating the best parts of religion consciously, and changing the parts that some of us maybe no longer believe in, or no longer are willing to advance as the end all be all.
Right. That's awesome. Thank you. Cindy asks to Jamie and Greg, how do you work with someone who has been radicalized to help walk them back? I get this question a lot. I'd like to hear from you.
Again, I want to stay away from having that be my expertise, because that's, it's not my personal
it's not mine either, but
experience.
it's a question I get.
I get it. I'll say, there's a couple things I would refer them in a lot of cases, because my personal experience of being non-religious is I came from a pretty non-religious background. And if anything, actively declaring myself to be a humanist and an atheist was almost like a step to the right, because we were so liberal that declaring ourselves to be anything didn't seem to make sense.
Right.
But some people really come at this identity that I hold from a place of deconversion, they might say. And I just did a podcast the other day with a friend of mine who I love, named Ryan Bell, his podcast is called Our Life After God. And the idea is he's somebody that came from a very, very traditional background, was a pastor in a strongly evangelical Christian community, and started disbelieving and eventually just is going to give himself 1 year without, 1 year to experiment with not believing in God. And then after the year, he said, yeah, spoiler alert. Yeah, I'm going to stick with this. And so, he's become a humanist leader. And if people are curious about this question, they can look at somebody like him. There are people who work on there's a guy named Steve Hassan, who most recently wrote a book about the cult of Trump, but that's because he came from the experience of being a cult expert, because he was in a religious cult himself.
Yeah.
So the point is that there are a lot of people out there who come to my affiliation of humanism from that place of extreme identity, totalitarian identity. You're only allowed to believe this, and we won't permit you any other education beyond it. And it's very hard if that's you or if that's a loved one of yours. And go seek out resources, go seek out help, because you shouldn't have to go through that alone.
Right. And that I think is a good call back to humanism too, is that we are together. Like you shouldn't have to go through this alone. And I think to Leon's question too is like, what I think your answer is like actually really amazingly cogent to what I've been answering is like religion kind of like you have an invention of like all these thoughts, and political might have the same like belief structure, but it does exist. It actually is in front of you. And like, I think the reference there is the second part of the question you answered, which is the cultish experience. Like that's maybe what we're looking at too, is that cults themselves sometimes do develop into religions, you know, like the Millerites ended up becoming like, it became religious. And so I think there's a way it can be religion-ish, but to use a weird
what I'm feeling moved to say about cults as it relates to this joint topic of humanism and technology, Jamie, is something I want to offer a little compassion here, because
Sure.
I mean, there's so much and so many people to be angry at right now.
Yeah.
But what I want to suggest is that the way a cult happens is that our world is terrifying.
Mm-hmm.
And it should be terrifying. I mean, it's understandably terrifying, because we live in this world where there's just so much to contemplate, where we're so our life is so precarious, you know, given our health situation, which is emphasized by COVID, but was always this way in a way, right? Our mortality, right? We could all get this fatal disease, potentially fatal disease tomorrow of COVID, but we all already have a fatal disease on top of that, which is that we one day, unsuspectingly, we're going to die.
That's it. Mm-hmm.
And the problems of, you know, we live on a planet that's so big that we're turning every moment around and around as if Superman is flying us through the universe, carrying us, and he's saying, I've got you, and we're looking back at him like Lois Lane and saying, who's got you? But we can't even feel it. It's so big, we can't even feel it. And that's terrifying. It's all really scary for any organism to try to recognize that. And so it's understandable that we try to come up with schemes, with plans, with ways to cope with that, to like, you know, to set up some certainty where there otherwise isn't certainty. And part of it is that people feel so disempowered, people feel so powerless, that one of the natural strategies to overcome that feeling of powerlessness is to puff yourself up, puff your chest up, and say, I am powerful. Listen to me. I will save you. I can rule you. I am strong. I am great. You know, I've felt a lot of that in my life too. You know, I've had a lot of moments in life where I just wanted to be loved or liked or seen as strong or powerful or smart or whatever. And it's taken a long time to realize that there's more to life than that. And I don't know if I would have ever fully gotten to a place where I could recognize that if I hadn't had a kid and sort of fell in love with him through his own vulnerability. You know, I don't know. So the cult, whether it's the cult of technology, the cult of extreme religion, the cult of politics, the cult of media and advertising, the cult of just wanting to be the end all be all to another person or to your own family. It all comes from a desire to control the uncontrollable and the terrifying. And if we could just have a little compassion for ourselves and for each other about that, we could get to the place where we realize, like, oh yeah, you know, I do want to control this crap, but you know what I want more than that even is just to love the people I love and to have them love me, to learn something, to have my curiosity be engaged, to feel like I got through a day and I didn't screw up, but I did something right for other people. Like, those are rewards that are so, they're small, they're incremental, but they're also self-sustaining. You can control those rewards in a way that you can't control becoming a deity. And there's something beautiful to me about that. And I think that if we did that, if we focused on that on a large scale where millions and millions of us were just trying to be human in that sense of the imperfect, the mortal, the finite, but the decent and the loving, we could build something better than what we've got right now within this lifetime, if we get that lucky.
My God, you moved me, man. Great. That was incredible. Thank you so much. I don't think I have anything more to follow up on that. That's an incredible amount of truth that is just really important for us to hear. And I really appreciate you doing your job and bringing those words to your students, to your schools, and to any student that really is interested, or people that are interested, especially us. I mean, that was incredible. So thank you. And those words are important to us because that's the push that we're doing. And we try to live that life on a consistent basis.
Well, Jamie, I've loved talking to you. It's a great conversation for people to have. If people are following you, and I know they are, and want to learn more, I would just tell them, seek out the people who taught me. And by that, I mean, in the most recent, I have certain teachers in the humanist movement that I've written about, if you want to read my writing, like my book, Good Without God and such, that you can read. But I think more recently, when I've tried to explore just what is it to be human, I've tried to read smart women who, just by being marginalized as women in certain environments like business and technology, have insights that I don't tend to have. I've tried to read, smart Black thinkers in all areas of life, and indigenous and other people of color, because just by virtue, or by virtuelessness of their having lived a life of marginalization in a way that I haven't, they just have human insights that I wouldn't have been able to come up with on my own. And the best of what I'm telling you is informed by having made a big effort. When I say a big effort, for the past few years, when I go to the bookstore, I look at my pile of books, because I'm a book addict. I'm a raging, fiendish book addict. And I look at my pile of books and I'm like, okay, is this more than half white male books? And if it is, I either have to put something back or go get something else. And then I've got to read that stuff, I try to do that with my music and the movies and the TV that I watch as well. Don't follow me. I mean, follow me on Twitter if you want. I try to be cute enough to follow, to be worth your 2 seconds to click. Greg M. Epstein. But don't follow me, follow them. And let's follow each other into something better than what we've got right now.
Greg, thank you so much for being here. This is fantastic. I really, really appreciate your time and your words and everything. So thank you again. And we will take that advice and we will share that with our audience and with each other. So thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Jamie. It's an honor to talk with you, and look forward to more.
Thank you.
All right.